Well, welcome everybody. This is Jussi Light from New Growth Counseling in Carlsbad with Stacy Costopoulos Smith and Anrea Morinoue. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
And this is our podcast that has not yet been named. You're catching us in the early stages of our content creation, and we want to welcome you to an extremely important podcast that I think we will probably refer back to a lot, ladies, as we do further content, because we're going to talk about relationship and attachment trauma. Last week, we did a whole show on anxiety and PTSD because so many of our clients come in with some form of injury that is sort of fear-based. And whether it's a sort of a low-level fear that's causing an anxiety or a very extreme kind of a fear that caused a PTSD-like response, we discovered and talked a lot about how sort of pervasive that is. And what we found ourselves discussing towards the end is how many of those traumas and injuries that are fear-based occur in childhood, actually. And the thing about childhood is, it is when you are the smallest that you'll ever be, and you are the least equipped in life to manage and handle extraordinary things. You don't have a fully adult brain, so even how you make sense of your world is sort of disadvantaged. We know that little children have this thing called magical thinking, where they believe in magic still. So when they're traumatized, they have a magical explanation for what happened. The dinosaur came and got me. And so we just could not talk meaningfully about trauma and anxiety without talking meaningfully about childhood. And a lot of therapists are well known for digging around in your childhood. And we want to talk today about why we do that here at New Growth, because we're not the kind of therapists who are going to spend 3 to 5 years looking at your childhood. We are highly targeting our assessment towards the attachment injuries that occur. And I think what we're trying to do here is to normalize something. We're trying to say that, you know, there are these really over-the-top traumas, a car accident, combat in a war zone, rape, sexual abuse, violence, these kinds of things. And everyone sort of knows that those are traumatic events. But there's so much that goes on when you're little, being teased, being ignored, etc. Or being sort of yelled at a lot by your folks who are frustrated and tired and aren't bad parents, but they're, overwhelmed or whatever. And so this happens to so many of us that we sort of write them off and don't really consider them as traumas. And yet our work together is sort of always focused, or at least I'd say 75% of the time focused on uncovering some wound that occurred in childhood when we were small, when we were in need and dependent and powerless and unable to either protect ourselves or make sense out of what happened to us, that impacts us and then just grows into our personality and our identity and sort of how we do life. And so we want to talk about attachment and relationship wounds, injuries, and traumas today to just normalize how often they happen, how easily they're overlooked, and yet how often when we find them, we can bring tremendous change to people's life that lasts forever, really, when we can address these early wounds. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really grateful to have you, Stacy and Anrea. Thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you.
And yeah. So just a quick review. We know that a trauma is a highly threatening experience coupled with being totally powerless. And we also know that without processing those traumas and wounds, a young child can develop all kinds of negative beliefs that are false and that aren't based in reality because they're not operating with full information. And so if they have enough of those kinds of experiences and form enough of those negative beliefs, we'll actually be able to see young children sort of making decisions about who they are and what the world is like, and that they're not even aware of. They're not aware that they're making a decision. And yet some early life decision has been made. And by the time we see this person in our office in their 30s, 40s, 50s, we see this decision that was made way back then has turned into sort of a life force that affects a lot of things negatively. And it's a real bind because most people are not aware that they made a choice when they were little. And so today we're going to talk about some of the things we see in our offices that we actually go back to those early experiences. And I think, Andrea, if you're okay talking first, when we were getting organized here, one of the things that you talked a lot about was how there's almost like a rigidity that starts to show up in how an adult is setting relationship boundaries. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, what you mean by rigidity and the kind of relationship boundaries that you see them maybe setting a little bit too rigidly.
Yeah. One of the things that I think there's the rigidity part, and then there's almost the flip side of that, which is being almost too flexible and having open boundaries. And so I think both of those things can show up later on in adulthood when we haven't or when we've been exposed to trauma as relational trauma as children. So something that I've noticed is, for instance, when someone is maybe too open with their boundaries or aren't willing to talk about when someone is having bad behavior, or they're being spoken to inappropriately, they're being treated inappropriately, and they have a very difficult time speaking up. That generally has something to do with the way that they were treated as children, and that their needs kind of got put on the back burner, right? That that they were taught as young kids that their needs were not as important maybe as their parents or the other people around them. And so I would say a lot of times what I've noticed too is that, and I don't know if you have both noticed this too, is when couples come together, a lot of times you'll see someone with maybe too flexible boundaries meet somebody that's pretty rigid. And so they find each other, and it's kind of it feels really great at the time. And then as their relationship progresses, they start to see, oh, wow, this person doesn't stand up to me. And then on the flip side, there's this person that tends to have really rigid boundaries. And if it's not their way, then it's not okay. Right. And so to talk a little bit about the rigidity part, in what I've noticed, it tends to come a lot from people that have experienced some chaos relationally early on in childhood. And that's not always the case, but sometimes that's what I see coming up. Because when you're in chaos as a child, you're doing everything you can to grab onto some sort of control. You're trying to control anything in your environment. And so once you realize, oh, that works, that makes me feel safe. Yeah. Then the rest of your life, you're searching for how to continue that control. Right. And so that shows up in your relationship with the other person.
Oh, wow. So true. What an excellent point.
Yeah, well said.
Really well said. Yeah. And then Stacy, in our preparation, you mentioned how it's similar, I think, in some ways, but how certain beliefs, right? Because Andrea's talking about maybe situations and responses to those situations, right? Getting the control to sort of self-soothe. But you were talking about maybe some of the beliefs that might form, when we're children, and how a sense of inferiority, a sense of inadequacy can form, and it can do so in a way that creates a bunch of assumptions that a person can carry into the future. Could you talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you're connecting the timeline there from, childhood moving into the future. And first, I feel myself wanting to say, when we talk about attachment trauma or relationship trauma from childhood, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're blaming parents as being bad parents. That most of the time, overwhelmingly, there's a really positive caregiving intent from the parents, and they're doing the best they can with what they have. Right. And we have to remember that they are a product of their own childhood,
Yeah.
which is a product of their parents, parenting. And so we've got this multi-generational pattern, and that is the human experience. And the challenges that come along the way are really just a testament to how rich our lives can be if we're able to acknowledge that, like, oh, this is my challenge, without judging it. And then in adulthood, how can I work through that? And if we're lucky enough to have an intimate partner to share that with, then again, the richness of life is even more available to us. But the beliefs early on as a child can really impact a person's development, because if we are not getting our attachment needs met, that sense of being valued for who we are and accepted and safe in our family, and instead we might be getting these messages that we don't deserve the attention, or that we are wrong, or that we are bad, or something like that. We don't know better than to question that as kids. We just assume that that's the way it is. I am bad is a belief that lots of kids will end up with, just as a way to make sense of something that doesn't feel good, that they don't know how to explain themselves. And so if that's the foundation that they have, and that doesn't get cared for and really reprocessed through childhood, then of course it only makes sense that that's what's going to be built on.
Yep.
And so we just keep on putting more and more experiences into that belief context. And then, lo and behold, as an adult, we don't even realize that we've built our entire life on this belief that I am not going to get it right, or I really need to defer to other people because I'm just not smart enough, or I can't trust myself. I really need to look to other people to tell me what's up, and that kind of thing.
So true. You ladies have really got your finger on some important pieces. Did you want to add anything to that, Andrea? I saw you.
No, I loved what you said, and it really resonated with me.
Yeah, we see a lot of this in our offices, don't we?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that I see a lot of is the fear of abandonment, which is such a tricky subject, because, again, if there has been a very obvious abandonment, like a divorce where a parent walked out and wasn't seen for either forever or many, many years, it's so obvious. And it's kind of very clear why that could be damaging. But people don't often realize how tired parents can be. Now, the three of us are parents, and we know how tiring it is. And back to Stacy's point about the vast majority of parents have very positive intentions, but they're humans, and they're limited. So a single mom who comes home after a second shift and picking up the kids from daycare is exhausted and sits down and veges out in front of the TV. She may not be emotionally present to her young children who are saying, "Look at mommy, look at what I did," or "Watch me build my Legos," or "Draw with me, play with me." And because the kid doesn't understand why, the kid can feel abandoned or even rejected, really, but they can feel abandoned, like, mom's sitting right there, but she's not with me, And there's that kind of feeling of loneliness and emptiness that can come. Parents who suffer from addiction, mild addictions, they have to have 2 or 3 drinks when they come home, parents who are deployed, parents who work a lot and are gone a lot. Children grow up, seeing their friends play with their dads, but I don't play with my dad, for no bad reason either. So there's so many ways, like, kind of a fear of abandonment can come. And then later in life, there's a way in which it feels like the person goes away. So I can be sitting there with my wife, but she's on her phone, and I get highly triggered because, like, you never are with me. You're always on your phone. And like, I'm feeling kind of all my life, I've been feeling like people aren't with me, and here it's happening again. Mm-hmm. And very often it's hard to work with folks in this place because legitimately their wife is on the phone, right? And you can sort of support their position, like, they're not just blaming someone, they're pointing something out that's real. But at a deeper level, there's also the piece that they have within themselves where when I chronically feel like someone's not there with me again, my level of pain skyrockets. And the person who's on their phone looks at me like, hey, I'm just on my phone. What's wrong with you? Well, that's that fear of abandonment coming up and those strong emotions. And so we want to deal with those kinds of feelings too, because people don't often connect back to those early life experiences where they really did feel very alone, and they really did have a good reason to predict that the person that I want is not going to be there. They're going to go away. Mm-hmm. And then they develop all kinds of things to like not have them go away. They might cling, or they might be furious when they come back, which is what children typically are, like, really upset. And so as a spouse, we get really upset. So there's lots and lots of ways that this one shows up.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think you were going to speak a little bit to the specific fear of rejection, right, Stacy? Like how people feel rejected. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. Going back to that thought about what were the negative beliefs about the self that a child could really incorporate into their whole life view. And then how does that come forward as an adult with a fear of rejection? Well, it could be a lot of things. And again, it doesn't necessarily always mean that it's an intentional abuse from a parent or a caregiver. It could be, just like you were saying, you see, just something as benign as mom's exhausted and she just doesn't have the mental bandwidth to be present. But when there's a message that the child gets that continually they're wrong. Did something happen?
Yeah, we locked up there. I don't know if it was me or you.
So sorry.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Oh, it's probably me. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's all right. So when a child starts to be maybe corrected without a validation or told that they need to perform or get over it or do something that is totally in contradiction with their emotional reality, then there's a chance that that child is going to start to believe that their emotional reality is never acceptable, like it's always wrong or it's damaged or something like that. And it just doesn't fit in with the rest of the world. And if they're getting that message from somebody who's really important to them, like a parent, or in the future, like if we're talking about adolescence, a peer group, or a really close friend, or a budding romance as a young adult or something like that, they may not have the tools to work that through to completion where they're able to step back and rely on their own sense of autonomy and just be like, no, I'm cool, I'm good, I'm whole.
Yeah.
In place of that sense of being whole is a sense of, I'm doing it wrong again. I'm inadequate. Something's wrong with me. And when that doesn't, get the attention that it needs, that can present a lot of suffering in the future. And so many times we just simply aren't even aware that we're suffering in that way. We're not aware that we've built up this belief about ourselves that we're inadequate. Sometimes we are. Sometimes, a person's more intuitive and they can spend some time thinking about it and really identify and wonder, like, why do I feel so inadequate? I wish I could stop this habit of always deferring to someone else, but I just don't know how.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it is kind of a belief about inadequacy, but when you think about what's going on between me and another person, the experience is you're rejecting me.
Yes.
Like you're the one sending the message to me that my emotions aren't okay. And I can either blame you and sort of lash out at you for rejecting me, or I can sort of internalize that and kind of believe that once again, I'm not lovable and I'm going to be rejected. And so I might as well not go to the party. I might as well not try.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like the belief might be I'm inadequate because the experiences left me with that conclusion. But the experience now is I'm being rejected.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Right.
Yes, right. And either way, whether you're in that internalizing aspect of it where you're really hurting with this negative belief about the self, or whether you're perceiving rejection from someone, whether it's there or not,
Right.
you're still suffering, because I think that the greater fear is the fear of the feeling that I'm not accepted.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
It's that the fear of the feeling itself that we want to avoid. So we get stuck in these patterns where we don't have to place ourselves there to feel it.
And if you wouldn't mind if I piggybacked off of that a little bit, it's this kind of visceral reaction that I have to what you're saying, because what I notice so often is that we have our own relationship with our emotions. So when we are taught as children that either you shouldn't feel this way, stop crying, don't feel anything. If you feel something, then that's wrong. Or, you should feel bigger about this. You should be mad about this. Like whenever a child is told how they should feel, then it creates this. I think you said it really beautifully, Stacy. You have this confusion about what you're feeling and if it's real, if it's not. And when you have a poor relationship with your own emotions, then not only are you afraid of your own emotions, but you're afraid of everybody else's emotions.
Right.
Right.
And so then, you get into a relationship with the partner or you're a parent, and not only are you not trusting what they're saying, and it probably then creates some invalidation that you're giving to that person, but you're also invalidating yourself all the time about what I'm feeling, and you're not trusting yourself in that. So, which then can create some discord in, especially I see it in spouses all the time, where one person has really big emotions and the other person completely shuts down the second that these emotions get brought up.
Yep.
Because they're so afraid of them. And so and then it's rejecting, and then the other person feels rejected. So it what I have found too is that a lot of people that are afraid of emotions actually have some really big emotions that they have no idea how to express.
Right.
Because it feels so scary.
So true. Yeah. I've come across that an awful lot. People will say, I'm just not an emotional person.
Right. They'll label.
They'll
Yeah.
label themselves that way, right? And that just gives me insight, like, okay, you were probably taught to believe that in some way. But the truth is that you are a human being, and we know that you're not a lizard. Lizards don't have emotions, is what we're taught, right? But if we're human, I like to think of it in like the human experience has three parts. We have a physical being, we have a cognitive being, we have an emotional being. And when we're trying to survive in a fast-paced society, the physical being, our physical needs take precedence. We've got to put food on the table. We've got to do what it takes to be able to feed our children. And in order to do that, we have to think. We have to plan. We have to get a job, whatever. But the emotional part of that is the third one that we just kind of sweep away.
Often neglected.
Often neglected. We don't give it the priority that it deserves. And so it's about learning to prioritize that, and can you feel safe enough to explore that? And it's okay if you don't feel safe enough to explore that, then we can talk about what's scary about that.
Yeah, and I think for the purposes of our show, we always want to come back to why we think about all these things we're discussing in terms of relationship and attachment traumas. Sure, if I am in a physically violent relationship for the first time at the age of 20, we're not thinking about that as a developmental trauma, because by 20, we've learned a lot about defending ourselves and our power. But relational traumas do affect us. So that female, if we go with a stereotype, that female who was in a domestic violence relationship in her 20s will carry some of that fear into a marriage later in her 40s, right? We definitely see that. So we definitely want to go back to that past point. But we're also talking about sort of the upbringing element, because like I said at the top of the show, when we are little, when we are children, we have the least amount of power that we're ever going to have. We have the least amount of cognitive processing and understanding. We have the fewest tools. We have the least life experience. And we're little. We're like physically small. So the world out there is way bigger appearing. And we also don't remember a lot of our childhood because as we continue in life, we're sort of focused here and now. So we tend to forget about how our lives maybe influenced us in these subtle kind of everyday ways, right? And so it's so important for us when we're dealing with the symptoms that we've been describing here, like this piece about how couples will get kind of fearful of any emotional expression at all. And we put it in the context of their attachment history, their relationship history. And as far back as we need to go, we want to make sense out of why emotions are scary. Right. Why is there this pervasive feeling that you're inadequate? Where did it come from? When did you learn it? Like, and we have our techniques. One day we'll do our show on EMDR and internal family systems and emotional focus therapy and all the different therapies that we use here to sort of get at this stuff. But I guess I should put a plug that yes, you can heal from everything we're describing, but it's really important to understand attachment history and the wounds and the traumas and the unrepaired injuries that has shaped us. And I think to that point, Andrea, you had said a lot about how actually, like when we have one of those attachment traumas in our lives, by the time we have our own kids and we're now parents, where we have the power and the little one who has no power, who depends on us is there, that sometimes actually parents get triggered by their kids. It happens more so in adolescence, right? When a kid can talk back and be disrespectful and things like that, right? And how parents get triggered by that. And then actually they believe that they're parenting their kid, but what we observe is they're actually protecting themselves and sort of using their power to maybe control their kid, to stop their kid from threatening them. It's a really difficult thing to talk about. We could maybe spend a whole show, but do you have some words you want to share with us about that whole thing?
Yeah, and I want to also validate you, Stacy, and what you were saying about, obviously what we're talking about right now can be triggering just listening to it right now, because it's this like, oh gosh, am I doing this as a parent, or did I receive this from my parents? And what you were saying before was beautiful about, yes, your parents are not perfect and you're not perfect. And so, yeah, we are doing these things. And so, I think, to touch on that, repair is something that is doable and that we'll talk about in a little bit about how these things can be fixed. But I think right now we're really focused on what how these childhood traumas affect us and how they come out. So about getting triggered as a parent, that is one of the hardest things to deal with, because you assume that your kids are going to be well behaved, they're going to listen to you, they're going to do all the things that you want them to do, and you know that because you're going to parent them the right way. And sometimes when we go into it with that mentality, there's a lot of control around that. And so when our goal is to control our kids, then that just screams to me that there is some issues that are coming up for us, and we're getting triggered by the fact that our kids are creating some sort of chaos. So it kind of goes back to my point from before, when it affects the relationship that we're in, maybe from a spousal aspect. This is how it presents as when you're dealing with a child, is that if you're in that place of needing to control your environment because it's the only way to feel safe for you, then when your kids create, some chaos for you, then your immediate reaction is to shut them down, is to create power and to power over them, which then enhances this disconnect that you're creating with your kids, and that they then feel invalidated.
Right.
And then it actually is damaging the relationship. And so, I mean, we could talk for, days about parental techniques that we can implement that does not create power over. But, there's also that, like, well, I'm a parent, so, of course, the way that you need to raise them is appropriate, but it can get to a point where, you can damage the relationship, like I had said before.
Right, because a parent that gets caught in a power struggle loses the flexibility that a parent not caught in this power struggle has. I found this with my own child. There are moments where I don't realize it. I'm at the restaurant and I'm embarrassed, frankly. And so my use of control and force to get my kid to stop embarrassing me is, I mean, you could look at it from the standpoint of all the other patrons, like, yeah, get that crying kid to shut up. I've certainly been there. I'm paying good money for this meal. I don't want to hear the crying kid. And who brings the crying kid to a nice restaurant like this anyway, right? So when I'm the parent with that kid, yeah, I'm embarrassed and I'm like using that control. But the message that I might send to the kid with my anger and like just grabbing them and the hostility that they take into their bodies, especially if they're real little, is going to be like terror. And we don't even realize it because they look angry and irritable and like they don't look particularly vulnerable to us. They actually, are annoying. So we don't realize that we could hurt them. So there's that, but it could easily be a teenager, right? It could easily be an 11-year-old, like, she gets her period. And mother had a very bad experience when she got her period. So now that daughter has the period, kind of all the emotions that happened for that mother when she was a girl are now happening for her as an adult. And here I am as a male talking about this with two females, right? But I've heard this so many times. I mean, like, I wish I had a nickel for how many times I heard this. And the mother's emotion sort of overcomes her from her past. And she sends this message to the child that's confusing around the child's body and like being disgusting, or I've heard so many things that are sort of bizarre. But then when I begin to understand that mother's own experience as a child, it all makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, you were made to feel horrible about your body and about this process that you have no control over. And, here's your daughter going through that, and it sort of brings that up and it catches you off guard, and your nonverbal communication sends the same kind of disgusted message, and your daughter takes that in and is wounded. And now this rift grows between the two of you, and you wonder why she doesn't come to you and why there's not trust. And it's 4 years since that moment. Like they're coming into therapy at 16, and the daughter says, I lost my connection to my mother when I got my period. And you realize, oh my gosh, that's when this rift began. It goes back there. And it doesn't just go back there for the daughter. It goes way back for the mom to the same place. And the horrible thing is that for 4 years now, they've had this distant relationship where the daughter feels like I can't trust her. She doesn't love me. She's disgusted by me. And I'm going to like go around her whenever I want something. And the mother's coming in saying she's defiant and she's sneaky and she lies and she blah, 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 and this horrible relationship dynamic is in play, but it all goes back to that attachment, like there was a violation.
Yeah.
And no one intentionally violated anyone. That's the darn thing about being a human being, right?
Yeah, so true.
So there's so much to say here. Yeah, go ahead. Here I am, a man opining about female menstrual cycles, and there's two women I'm talking to. Go ahead.
No, I think that's really true. And again, this is our humanity. This is life. It's okay. And it's important to be able to have a safe place to process those things. And doesn't that talk too about society and what's taboo and what's not, and the shoulds that you were talking about before, Andrea, because we do oftentimes think I shouldn't feel this way, or somebody will tell us you shouldn't feel that way. You should feel this way. Especially as a child, you were talking about how sometimes parents will say like, stop crying, you're okay. And again, their intent is they don't like to see their children suffering. Or like you were talking about, you see being out at a restaurant and your child's having a meltdown or something like that. You don't see their vulnerability in that moment.
Right.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because wow, what a way to offer a new perspective on something, for a parent to become aware. Like, of course, as a parent, you're freaking out because you're in this public place and you've got an obligation to the people around you. And all you see and hear is this loud noise, and you've got the embarrassment. You don't realize that there's a reason, there's something going on for the child, that they have some kind of need that's not being met. They're suffering, or they're vulnerable. So taking yourself out of the equation and being able to ask, oh, can I see it differently? Can I? Like, really, can I? Can I practice that? That's a skill that we can help with, learning how to take yourself out of that situation. And I think it goes, like, to get back to, we were talking about when inferiority is a part of the picture. That can happen even if it's not in a public place. There might be a sense of embarrassment around parenting, even if it's in an extended family, or at a birthday party, or a time where if the parent suffers from a sense of inferiority, and let's say they're a new parent, parenting is new to them, which means if they're already anchored in a sense of inferiority, well, here's this whole new scenario to be inferior on. Parenting. And even if that's in the eyes of their own parents, or their best friend, or the other moms in the neighborhood, or whatever, that can come into play there too. And then all of a sudden, the parent is doing some protective move of their own, instead of creating the safety for the child, like you were saying before.
And then inadvertently, now when it's a very young child, maybe not so much, but if that child is, say, 6, inadvertently sending a message to that child that the child takes in, which causes them to feel inferior. And then here we go, we're setting up the next generation. And it's terrible, because, you look at that, and it's so easy to blame a parent if you're relating to the child. But if you're relating to the parent, it's like, what can you do? All 3 of us are parents. We've all talked about how we've hurt our kids inadvertently, and we see the damage later, and we're therapists, and my God. It's the human condition. And I think sort of one takeaway here is that when we see clients in our office, we are especially sympathetic to normalizing that your parents didn't mean their motivation wasn't bad. And if you felt loved by them, you probably were loved by them. And if you didn't feel loved with them, you still were probably loved by them. You just didn't feel it. And why didn't you feel it? Well, what were the messages that came through? Daddy doesn't have time for me because he's always working. I'm a piece of whatever. No, that's not the right message to take away. But it's true that Dad was working a lot, and there's sort of a grief that I missed him, and I long for him. And we find that those vulnerable feelings of longing really get at the underlying unmet need, right? In attachment and bonding, we have needs. As dependents, we need our parents. We need them to protect us. We need them to nurture us and be warm towards us. We need them to see us and to know us, in that non-sexual way, so that when we have a romantic partner with whom we are sexual, there's that non-sexual element, that like that foundation you were talking about. If there's a foundation of an inferiority, and then you add a sexual relationship on top of that, there's so much more vulnerability where there's not in a non-sexual friendship, So what we need from our parents, when, first of all, we don't need sex with our parents, right? Do a whole show on incest. But our parents are supposed to be that super safe place where we can be seen and understood and listened to, And as a result of being seen and listened to, get a reflection back from them that says you're wonderful, or you're talented, or I'm really interested in you, right? And then that can kind of go into the child and feel like have this incredibly positive result in the development of who they are, that I'm worthy, right? I'm worthy of my father's attention. Like, he's a really busy man, but he stops for me. And that says something about how important I am, and that I'm good. And if that can be the foundation, then when I get out there with my peers and my adolescents, where it's high stakes, man, and all the pressures, right? If I'm carrying that sense of worth in my soul, then when I get to the even higher stakes of that romantic relationship, I can be secure and solid in myself because of what was formed in that attachment. So I think we talk a lot about the attachment needs that we all have. And when they're not met, we can always find the longings, the wishes that they had been met. And that's what shows up in adults, right? They come in their romances kind of wishing and longing for the same things that they never got, and really bent out of shape about that because they're still not getting them, and kind of powerless feeling because they don't know how to get them, and possibly even blaming and being like it's all their fault, when there's actually an element inside themselves that needs to be looked at too, right? So I feel like I'm doing this almost summary right now because I'm aware of the fact that we're closing at the end of our time. Do you all have a few minutes now, or do we have appointments we have to get to next? It's 10:30.
Oh, I'm good till 11.
I'm okay for 15 minutes.
I'm okay for about 4.
Okay.
So what do you want to say in wrapping up? There's a lot we didn't get to here today, and yet a lot that we covered already.
Yeah. I mean, when you kind of are wrapping things up, what I kind of get as the gist, as the end game for me, is that, you know, as human beings, what we need to know is that we are loved for who we are, and that we are worthy for who we are. Being human, all the flaws that we have, all the reasons that we get triggered, all the things that you know are maybe our behaviors that we are just now recognizing as, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I've been doing this. So as adults, we still need the same thing as kids, right? And so and I think if we can learn that all kids really need is safety and protection and love, that if we do make mistakes and when we are triggered, and when we do these things that we're like, ugh, and we do them with our partners, we do them with our friends, you know, we are triggered by things, and it's okay. And that the first step in this is to just be able to say, I get triggered. I have reactions, you know, and I have reactions that are not always helpful, but that I can do something about it.
Yeah. Good stuff.
Yeah. I like the way you say that, Andrea, and that makes so much sense. And I think that it is hard sometimes for people, especially for people who may not have had a lot of experience with therapy, or like doing self-reflection or something, you know, like that. It is hard to be able to say, like, oh, I am getting triggered. I am, you know, just to recognize that, and then to be able to also put aside one's ego and say, oh, you know, maybe I could have done something that would have been a little better, or maybe I am doing something that is not really great in my relationship with my spouse or my child or a friendship or whatever. But to be able to own the responsibility without judging yourself for it, because that's when you get the freedom. That's when you can be empowered to make real change. If we get stuck in judging ourselves for having done something wrong, then we're really suffering in that stuckness.
Boy, there's a title for a new show: Stuck in Self-Judgment. I type it in as I hear it. That's a really good point. There are ways out of these binds that we've been talking a lot about. And I think people listen to shows like this because they're searching and they're wanting tools and information. And we're trying to promote understanding here. So people often forget that awareness and education is a tool. And so hopefully we've provided a little bit more. And also some motivation to be open to the idea that your history over the course of your entire life, starting when you were born right up to the present day, is filled with relationships where you were dependent and required care as a child. And as you grew, you had needs that changed. When you're a toddler, your needs are evident. And then when you become a 5-year-old, they shift. And then a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And then right before puberty, the shifting just is kind of happening all the time. And yet the whole thing that maintains and stays the same is that need for a caregiver to see me, to recognize all the needs that I have. Like, I need to get to my game. Can you give me a ride, right? And that fundamental need to be seen and known and to have worth and value and to be protected, right? These needs just, they never really stop. Right. It's just that we grow and we take into ourselves the results of that caregiving relationship, actually. Mm-hmm. And so that attachment, that bond, it can be a negative bond, it can be positive, but whatever it is, it's inside of us. And by the time we are independent in our adulthood, we are carrying around inside of us all the experiences that formed the beliefs that shaped how we became independent, right? Because when we become independent, we take over and we protect ourselves. We don't rely on another in the same way that we did when we were 3, right? And how we might protect ourselves is partially a reflection of whether we were protected or not, and how that protection may have looked. Like, mm-hmm. Were we controlled a lot? Were we shamed? Were we invalidated? If we were, we develop a way to protect ourselves from being invalidated and shamed, and we might be very defensive. And so we're very interested as psychotherapists at looking at your attachment history and any traumas or wounds that weren't repaired over the course of your lifetime, because chances are real high that if you're feeling bad about yourself and you don't know why, or you suffer from low self-esteem, if you have fear of abandonment that you can't control, or you're having problems in relationships that are sort of part of a bigger pattern, or if you find that everyone else is always at fault, including your children, that often these places inside of us they come into focus, actually, and they make sense when we can understand an attachment history and go, that makes sense now. I get why you feel the way you do. I get why you do what you do. Yeah, it might be wrong in the eyes of someone over here, and it might even be wrong in the eyes of yourself because you feel ashamed and you judge yourself, but it makes sense, actually. There's a place in your life that this comes from that we can understand. And now, as adults, we can process it differently and maybe look at it again and feel it again and come to a new conclusion now that you're not so little and that you're wiser and you have experience, and you can form a different feeling in your body, and then that becomes the new foundation, right?
Right. Yeah, it's all about filling in those missing places where something was missing that was preventing a person from being able to do that on their own. So we investigate and we find out what's missing, and then we help that person put something in that place, right, that creates that sense of wholeness. So it's not just a magical retelling of the story.
Right.
Really, it is something that you internalize and build up inside yourself so that you've got that sense of wholeness.
Yeah, you get to feel what you should have felt the first time is kind of our hope.
Yeah, I like that.
And a lot of times we'll see that when we're doing couples therapy is that they get to heal together because they get to lean on each other.
Right. That's what's so beautiful about that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they get to come alongside each other and understand that this thing that's been going on between them has roots somewhere else.
Yes.
And it's not the other person's fault. And now they can sort of join
Right.
together, and they can
Yes.
do that investigation that Stacy just mentioned. You know,
Mhm.
and I think, don't you agree that the obstacle is always self-judgment, criticism, shame, you
Mhm.
know, and then as we kind of work to make space that, you know, like self-judgment and criticism and shame have their place, we understand why they're there, but we sort of ask that to kind of move over here and then come back to that investigation without
Mhm.
all that.
Yeah.
And then they can together sort of collaboratively, oh wow, you weren't validated. No wonder you get so upset with me when I interrupt you, because you feel invalidated. I'm just trying to clarify something, but I get it now.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Until you feel a lot more seen and heard, I'm going to be really careful about interrupting you, because I get what this is really about.
That's
Yeah.
just it. Yes. Yes.
And then they're a team, right? So we definitely see this showing up in couples work. We see it showing up in individuals and with parents and children, and how parents can break the cycle
Yeah.
and then sort of repair it with their child and fill their child up in a
Yeah.
way that doesn't require therapy in 30 years.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's exciting.
It is. We're lucky to do what we do.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful for this. This work is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks again, Andrea. I really appreciate your insights and your willingness to participate this morning.
Thank you. I've loved this time that we got to spend together. I feel like this was a good one today. I liked it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was important information.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. We're getting our groove.
Yeah, and to you, Stacy, thank you very much for your thoughts and your sharing.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm grateful to be here. It was a really nice meeting today.
And
Yeah.
thank you, Jussi, for being able to wrap it together so nicely.
Yeah, definitely.
I appreciate that. So yeah, this is Jussi Light for New Growth Counseling in Carlsbad and La Jolla. I forget, we have a recently opened La Jolla office with Stacy Costopoulos Smith and Anrea Morinoue. We appreciate your feedback and comments. Go ahead and leave anything you like below, unless we have our comments turned off, and you can be frustrated at me for inviting you to do so. But we thank you very much for your time, and you can get in touch with us by going to our website, newgrowthcounseling.com. And I don't know how to end the show other than to say goodbye.
Awesome job, everybody.
Yay!